Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one I will keep combining 3D and 2D as I've done before and show you how I got this shot done. I'm currently working on scenes for my film which actually does not contain characters. I have a rough idea of all the shots that will be needed, but I still haven't gotten around to design the actual characters, so I'm kind of procrastinating on that one and focusing on some cutscenes that I for sure know can be part of the film. I kicked this scene off by placing out all these stones in Cinema 4D. These are all just two different stone models that I made, that I then squashed and stretched to make them slightly vary from each other. I set up a camera and then just figured out where each element should go. One of the main focuses of this scene was the creek that runs between the rocks. I defined that using a warped plane that follows the path I imagined the water would take. Using a cloner, I could spread out a lot of small versions of the rock on the riverbed. I set it so that the cloner used a plane as an object to spread its clones over. By then pushing the geometry of that plane up and down in certain areas using the magnet tool, I could show more or less of the clones where I wanted them. Having added a stone texture that I painted onto these rocks using Redshift materials, I got some base to start painting from. Here it's important that I find my camera angle and lock that down. A good trick is to put a protection tag on the camera at this point so that I don't accidentally move it without noticing. I will need this camera position when projecting my painted textures back onto the geometry. In Photoshop I spent a lot of time adding details to the stones. This is a pure painting stage and possibly my favorite bit. I made sure to keep the different depths on different layers. By having a foreground, midground and background painted, I made sure that there are information behind the rocks, as they will need to be projected back onto the different 3D models later. A scene with a lot of parallax will require this, as there would otherwise be some stretching of the textures, and you would see it break the moment you move the camera. I also kept elements like plants that would overlap the background on its own layer. These were later projected onto 3D cards, and using their alpha channel, they blend in well in the 3D scene. What this does is really breaks that 3D sharp look that geometry gives. With this technique, I can have painted blades of grass come off the top of the rocks, and I think it really makes a big difference here. As you can see, the different layers were projected back in Cinema 4D. The background was painted and dropped onto a plane to create some depth. I animated the camera moving through the scene, and then all these bits were rendered and brought into After Effects, where I put my final scene together. For the water, I used the plane I mentioned in the beginning as a mat or a mask to limit where my water elements would show up. I then created some 2D animated looking ripples that represents the shadows or reflections of the surrounding rocks, and also some highlights on the water surface. And finally some splash animations that would sit at the bottom of the small waterfall, or whatever you would call this slight shift in height here. These assets were created and animated on top of the original painted frame. They were then projected onto the water geometry in Cinema 4D to follow the camera motion in the same way that the rest were. As I said, by using this black and white matte I rendered from the 3D software, I could use that to composite all my bits together. I set what color my water should be, I added some distortions to the riverbed below, and I could also decide how transparent it could be and so on. Finally, a bit of grading, some light rays from the background and some grain tied the final image together. Here it is in its final stage one more time. I think this one hit the right point between 2D and 3D, and I'm excited to get on to the next one. By the way, thanks to those who joined me on Patreon, I highly appreciate that. Also, make sure to like and subscribe here on YouTube if you enjoyed this type of content. I will see you in the next one. Bye.